Welcome back, my friends. My name is Apollonius of Tired, and I am so tired. Welcome back to episode 3 of my show, which increasingly feels like some kind of diary or journal where I share my experiences. Last time I talked about some of my experiences as a Christian. Now, of course, it was heavily truncated. How could it be otherwise? There's 25 years of experience as a Christian condensed down to, an hour? I had to leave a whole heck of a lot out. Well, something actually came up this week. I was invited to a friend's baptism, and bear in mind, I didn't grow up Baptist. I grew up in an Anabaptist tradition. There's nothing churches love more than separating over ideas that may or may not be integral to the salvation of their members, as most of us are all well aware. But that meant that this would be my first time in a church in almost 5 years. I stopped going to church when the pandemic hit in March of 2020, and since it's January as of the time of this writing, that all adds up. And on top of the gap, it's a denomination that I wasn't actually as familiar with as my own. And this wasn't just a wedding or a funerary service either. This was a real, honest-to-God baptism event. I had no idea that Baptists made these things such a big thing, although I probably should have assumed that, based on the name alone. And of course, I do have some exposure to Baptist sermons from growing up around people who were Baptist and dropping in for the occasional post-Christmas service or whatever. They weren't quite Methodists, and a lot of the fire-breathing preachers I'd listened to as an angsty teen were almost all, independent Baptists, quote-unquote. So I figured I knew what to expect. Golly gee willikers, was I wrong. I was there technically to see a friend of mine get baptized. However, I guess I had assumed that since the baptisms were preceded by testimony, I'd hear people's reasons for belief. Now this, of course, intrigues me more than anything else. I truly want to understand why people believe the things that they believe. I'd probably even said that before. To me, these reasons are more important than the beliefs themselves. Typically. There's exceptions, of course. Like, if someone's belief is extremely harmful or leads them to hurt others, then I'll probably care more about that than about why they have those beliefs, at least at first. While I did learn a lot about people's reasons for being a part of a church, I didn't really learn much about the reasons why people believe. Some people even seemed to specify that there's a lot of reasons why people don't believe. More on that later, though. One of the most interesting things that I found was that consistently, across the board, everyone described their feelings of being alone and feeling, quote-unquote, distant from God. Then, when they'd find this church, they'd suddenly feel God's love, quote-unquote, once they joined this community. People talked about being at their lowest, struggling with addictions, or feeling like they fell away from God. Now, none of them, with one exception, said that they'd actually stopped believing in God. In fact, most of them credited their childhood homes and their immediate families with their exposure to the gospel. Most of them had actually been raised in another form of Christianity. There were literally 80% Catholic converts here, all of whom expressed their loneliness or their lack of engagement with the Bible as reasons for them leaving their churches and coming to this one. My mind was open wide at this point. I was attentive, listening to person after person describe how they'd always been believers in a church of some kind, in God or in Jesus, and now they wanted to either affirm that they were saved in this new faith, or that they were old enough to understand the commitment to the church that this baptism represented. But hold up. I thought that a baptism was supposed to be a sign of faith in Jesus and not a sign of commitment to some group of people who accept you. But story after story revealed that people were constantly anxious, depressed, or living in sin, only to feel like they'd been saved after falling in line with this particular group of Christians. Some of them had even been raised in this exact church, but felt like they had to do something to show their faith. And no, I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth. Every person who got dunked in the water had to give a one-page testimony explaining their reasons for wanting to be baptized. And as a little aside, one page is very relative. Some people had, you could tell, quite large handwriting and wrote on a single side, and some people more or less did what I would consider stapling pages together continuously so that it would count technically as one long page front and back. This kind of shocked me, to be honest. If I'd wanted to get baptized, I figured I'd want to do it because I knew that the religion itself was real, that I'd had some kind of experience with the supernatural, or maybe had something that solidified my absolution and removed any doubt from my mind. But for the majority of these people, it just sounded like they really wanted to follow Jesus by becoming part of this new group of people. It almost felt like a non sequitur. Did being a part of this group not give them what it took to feel like Jesus was real and leading this group? Did they have to reaffirm their commitment to this specific church in order to find out whether or not Jesus was actually at the helm? It was admittedly very odd for me. For one thing, I felt a slight sense of smugness that these people felt like they had to redo their baptisms for them to, I guess, count. Since I had come from an Anabaptist background and we didn't believe that infants could consent to baptism, pretty much everyone we baptized was an adult who had come to that decision as a conscious agent. So in some respect, I feel like the fact that people intuitively understood that it's really kind of silly to baptize infants, it helped me feel a little bit better about myself and the beliefs I used to have, as crazy as that sound. But the other thing was, some people literally had been baptized at other places, quote unquote, fell away, whatever that means, and then got re-baptized here. If anything, this view of baptism made it feel less like a ritual where they signal their devotion to Jesus and become made anew, and more like an acceptance ritual into a group of like-minded individuals. If anything, it felt entirely social, with the exception of the magic spells in tandem with the water magic. If it really was water magic, though, it would probably carry in the eyes of God in spite of whatever denomination you go to, right? You don't think you could deceive God by taking a baptism without a right heart, right? Or maybe you think that people can give deceptive baptisms into the wrong forms of Christianity and then have those be overwritten in order to correct the baptism. And what do people actually believe about baptism? Why does sprinkling some water on someone or immersing them in a pool and saying some magic words over them have any bearing on something that people believe is totally immaterial in the first place? How can a physical thing affect a non-physical thing? People believe in souls still in Christianity, right? I'm not way behind the times on that one. In fact, one of the guys who gave a mini sermon of his own before getting baptized described how his mind, body, and soul were all getting sick as a result of his sins. He described doing some pretty rough stuff, even went into descriptions of cheating on his wife. A lot of people described infidelity to their spouses. There was so much of this that I began to question what the heck was going on when a literal child said they had succumbed to lusts over and over and had committed infidelity against their future spouse and God. Suddenly, it clicked for me. These people were absolutely using the most loaded language possible to describe things that literally do not reach those levels. But wait, it's the Christian view that all sin is equal, right? But like, cheating on a spouse is not nearly the same thing as having a little bit of self-pleasure every now and again. And here were these people of all ages describing their sexual sins of lust as if just thinking about someone attractive made them a cheater. But it does, according to Jesus at least. Jesus literally told people, if you believe that the Bible accurately describes what Jesus said, that thinking about someone with lust in your heart is literally the same thing as infidelity. I forgot that Christianity was all about thought crime and not much in the way of accountability for real crimes. One example of this was the really intense moment when one woman went up and just started listing all of her sins. It got really quiet in this church, which only 20 minutes earlier had a full rock band with multiple vocalists playing all sorts of modern worship songs. She just kept going and going and going, and at one point haphazardly threw in, "I had an abortion," into her list of sins. Like, I had to hold back from gasping. I looked around frantically trying to see how people were reacting to this, but they were just nodding. Now, I'd heard from Baptists in particular my entire life that abortion was murder. That exact phrase over and over. They would say it and hold up signs and protest clinics that conducted abortions. But like, it was no different than some kid saying he struggled to not think about cute girls in his class. People just looked at her with a face of pity and acceptance, as if to say, "Yes, queen, let it out. We accept you." This, in some sense, proves to me that they absolutely don't believe that abortion is murder. They just view it as some lesser sin, like being vaguely turned on by people. If someone had gone up there and literally said, "I killed a 3-year-old," people would not be nodding. Heck, she could say, "I drowned my infant intentionally. It had only been alive a week." People would literally be calling the police on her while she was still in the dunk tank. But no, not a single person in there had made a cognitive or subconscious connection between abortion and murder. Not at any level that would be expected if they really believed that abortion was murder. They just didn't care. If anything, that was kind of a relief for me. These people don't actually believe abortion is murder. They just kind of say that. They don't treat it the same way. They don't even view it the same way. I mean, at this point, I take vegans way more seriously when they say meat is murder than Christians seriously when they say abortion is murder. Because at least a vegan would be sick if they heard someone talking about killing a pig, even for their meal. A Christian just nods and says, "Yeah, abortion happens, but now you're washed clean of your sin." I couldn't really believe it. And yet, there was still more to learn. There were stories people told of meeting Jesus after getting some kind of brain damage or falling into a coma or sustaining some kind of drug-influenced brain injury. These were the people I empathized with the most. Once your brain is damaged, that's your sense of self. That's who you are. A lot of these people needed some kind of hope. There was one person in particular who stood out to me as having a different story from the rest. She was raised in a Jewish family to be Jewish, and none of her family converted to Christianity. She, however, was approached at either school or work by people who wanted to save her soul. So she listened to them, and having been raised with a vague sense of God in her life from having been raised in synagogues, she eventually ended up converting to Christianity. She would tell her family about Christianity and about the hope she had because of it, and of course the community that she'd found of people her age instead of all those people at the synagogue that she'd see once a year. So of course I'm thinking, here's another person whose reason for belief is that she wants to be in a community of people her age who share beliefs that she's pretty comfortable with. But unfortunately, I don't think that's quite the case for her. She lost her father fairly recently. She told us stories of how he would ask her about her faith and listen to her talk about her new community. He sounded like a great guy, but I can't help but notice that she never said whether or not he converted. In a story like this, I'm almost positive that if he had, she would have said so, because she made it clear. She wanted to be baptized because she wanted the promise that she would see him again in heaven. She wanted desperately to believe that he could be found even after he'd passed on. She wanted her father again. One thing that hit me pretty hard was that she said, "I want to believe that he's looking down at me now and that he is proud of me." How do you deal with something like that? There's nothing about that in the theology. There's nothing about good people going to heaven even if their kid gets baptized. She just really, really wanted to believe it would be true. This poor girl had lost her father, and the church promised her that she'd be able to see her lost father again. But they're relying on a lot of layers of ambiguity. First, it's not proven that heaven is real. Two, it's not proven that specific people converted to Christianity before they died, and even if they did, what if they got baptized into the wrong one? Third, it's not proven that even if there's exceptions made for non-Christians, that anyone's family member is one of those exceptions. And fourth, it's not proven that Christians would even be the ones to have this particular afterlife, even if an afterlife was proven. The further you get into these ideas of heaven and seeing our loved ones again, why is there any reason at all for someone to believe that it would be their particular family members that weren't Christian who will be in heaven? It doesn't make any sense. And if they're in heaven and the family member isn't, doesn't that just mean they went to heaven for one thing and didn't get it? They wasted their whole life chasing that outcome only to not get it. Or let's do an even darker hypothetical. What if Christianity is a false religion that ends up in the worst possible afterlife, sequestered away from all those good family members who died without Christianity, as if they're in a better afterlife? That's even worse. Knowing that someone changed religions away from the religion of their family and thus won't see them in heaven or some other afterlife. The more you think about it, the less it makes sense. And yet, one of the people who got baptized was a woman in her late 70s who just wanted to be with her family in heaven. The stories she told of having been raised by parents she loved, who raised her to love Jesus and promised to see her again after they passed. She too was just clinging on to the hope that as she gets older and as she inevitably passes, that she could have her parents in her life again. That she could live an even better life than this one and see friends and family and praise the God who brought them back together. Of course, hell always looms not far behind any discussion of heaven. Because like many Christians, a baptism is also a form of fire insurance. I think my greatest takeaway from it all, if I'm being honest, is that Christianity tends to give people terrible priorities. And here's what I mean. When your life is based on preserving images instead of valuing things that should actually matter, it inverts your priorities. Looking good and fitting in matters more than actually helping a community. Looking like you're blameless matters more than actually avoiding behaviors that could incur blame. Instead of focusing on self-improvement, you focus on making sure that no one sees the parts of you that need improving. Instead of fixing abusive relationships, you make sure no one knows that they're abusive. And if they find out, you forgive without going through any reconciliation. Because looking like someone who forgives unconditionally matters more than actually going through the messy, painful process of reconciling with someone you hurt or who hurt you. But this also has an even darker side to it. Suddenly, all sins are equal. So if someone admits to something that you genuinely believe to be horrific and immoral, it's now your obligation to forgive them because they already gave it to God. This painful process of pretending to forgive and pretending to forget without doing any of the things that even the Bible itself prescribed for better outcomes, it's part of the expectation in order to share a community. It's conditional love, and that love looks a lot like love, but underneath the surface, all the passion and desire to protect is funneled into the image, an idol created out of blamelessness and image management. It's not supposed to work. It's supposed to protect itself and preserve the power structure of the greater community. The church leaders don't have to deal with it. The congregation doesn't have to deal with it. They can all just collectively agree that they've moved on, and so should everybody else. This perverts the human inclination to see people get better. This bastardizes the human desire to reconcile, and it exploits the goodness in people to the benefit of people who would do real harm. And it wouldn't have to happen this way. If only people took the time to learn what's actually healthy. But it's not psychologists, scientists, or sociologists informing people of the most up-to-date and sound methods of behavioral interaction in order to foster a healthy community with stronger bonds. It's pastors and church leaders. Oftentimes, the very people who benefit financially the most from sweeping things under the rug. It's the greater conferences who set the rules and frameworks for how their congregants are supposed to act. It's the leader of the house church who calls anyone who betrays any human emotion at all possessed. Squash the dissent. Embrace the collective. That's it. What are you going to do? You could find a different church, or you could leave, only to have no community left. I jumped the gun a bit there. My apologies. I needed a moment to collect myself. What do you usually do when you're trying to collect yourself? Typically, I make or listen to music. It puts me in a headspace where my mind can start to feel things that I may be struggling to put into words. Just listen, feel, and embrace the emotion. What a shame that the emotions evoked by the music I heard at this church were so uncomfortable. You know that feeling of wanting to throw up but not having anything left? That's what the music can feel like when you really listen, especially to the lyrics at a church service, and especially this particular brand of Baptist music. It's clearly inspired by things that were on the radio a decade ago, or maybe when they came out. The difference being that it's clearly toned down to the point where everything is utterly predictable. But that's not what really matters. After all, it's music designed for a singular purpose. Be sung by a crowd of people. A lot of people who may not have heard it before, but want to be included in this crowd. And in a sense, that's admirable. They've accomplished their goal. It feels like you know all the words, even if you've never heard them before, and the slides with the lyrics ensure that there are no surprises. I'm not complaining. I grew up Mennonite. We had to read sheet music for a good chunk of time before we quote-unquote modernized. I'm familiar with the general ebb and flow of Christian music, thank you very much. But if you haven't heard any in a while, let me warn you. It is worse than you remember, and the new stuff is worse than you could imagine. Thought experiment time. Imagine the most abusive thing you can say to someone without actually crossing the line into downright, I'm calling the cops territory. Now pretend that you're forcing someone to write those very same things down from their own perspective. Instead of, you're not worth anything, I'm the only one who gives your life meaning, you have them sing something a little fluffier and make it sound like they're the ones who thought of it, of course. Even under threat, I don't think I could possibly come up with better lyrics to fit that prompt than Christian songs that already exist. Let me quote one. No music to make it more comfortable, just straight. A moment is worthless. No meaning, purpose. Every breath is just wasted if you are not the center of my world. I'm just drifting, barely existing. Every minute without you is worthless. How badly do you have to be victimized before you'll willingly repeat those words? How much self-worth do you think are you expected to have if your church makes you sing those words along with 100, 200, thousands of people? And no, those lyrics are in context supposed to be good, admirable. At least when you have songs like In Christ Alone, they're talking about how much Jesus is their strength. That's kind of positive, right? And I won't dig at them for that. They have these beliefs that they can be strong when the king of the universe is on their side, but it feels like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. They want to feel like they're suffering, so they're abusing themselves and falling down, contrite, to beg God for forgiveness for hurting themselves. And God, they believe, will do it because he loves them so much, even in their worthlessness. That's not love. If you create a child, you don't love them in their worthlessness. You don't love them in spite of how disgusting they are. You know that they have value and worth. You know that they are loved because they deserve to be loved. You know that your child is worth more than the stars and the moon in the sky because they're human. They have value. They're part of a species that's smart, introspective, social, collaborative, part of something greater. Part of a species that creates art, music, movies, books, studies the ends of the earth and the smallest quarks. We want to know everything about this world and then show its beauty, reflect it back in as many forms as you can imagine. We love because it's who we are, and we want to protect because we love. To try and negate this through repeated attempts at destroying the individual and replacing it with a culture of self-loathing and violation of the natural love that humans feel for each other is disgusting. Creating an us and a them instead of a human in-group is despicable. We deserve better, and so do many of the people who got baptized. One man had absolutely tragic outlooks on his baptism. He was depressed. He felt like nothing he could do would work until he gave it all up and pursued God instead. Of course, God sent him to this particular church, and not the churches that didn't work before. He knows that this is where he has to be, because God sent us, and I quote, confusion to let us fall into sin. Wait, hold on, what? That was a direct quote, by the way. Let me restate it for you, just in case you didn't pick up on how horrifying it was. God, that is, the creator, loving creator, of all humanity, quote, sent us confusion. This is a fun reframing of the idea that God deceives people. And then what? Quote, to let us fall. That's right. He causes us to stumble by sending confusion, but he lets us fall. Tricky, tricky. Very cool wordplay to take the responsibility away from the most powerful being of all time. I guess he only knocked down the first domino, but let us fall at the end. Oh, wait, am I missing something? Right. Quote, into sin. It's hard for me to tell if he meant that we're allowed to fall into sin, or it's God's fault that sin is allowed in the first place. See, his mental health issues, his self-loathing, his self-esteem, all his pain was on display. But he had to thank God for it, because that's all he's allowed to do. He has to pretend like it was all for a better purpose, so he could end up in this church. And this one would surely work this time. Not like all those other churches that God allowed him to go to by confusing him about what kind of church he should be in. I'm willing to bet that you're already begging the question, how does he know he's not still confused and going to the wrong one? Well, I'm glad you asked. He already had an answer for that. Because as he put it, now he knows that, quote, God wants us all to be loved by him. So let me get this straight. He hurts you and lets you suffer until you realize that all he wanted was to love you the whole time. As if he couldn't just choose to be a loving parent. As if you had to make the wrong choices over and over until you came to the realization that this negligent parent would never come to your aid, or, I don't know, told you what he wanted, would just let you come to the right conclusion. For no real reason, of course. He didn't share how God told him this. He just realized it eventually. Because that's what it screams to me when someone lets me hurt by myself over and over, tells me that I'm worthless without them. They really just wanted to show me how much they loved me. Right. But I guess humans have the excuse of being confused, scared, worried, generally fallible. What if I don't do it right? What if I make it worse? God doesn't get that kind of consideration because he knows how to do it right and how not to make it worse. But instead, he'd rather be petty and let you figure it out on your own, without him having to prove anything. If a teacher didn't teach anything, just waited until someone else taught you, not even at school, mind you, but just whenever you end up at some random friend's house who happens to know the answer, you'd be justified in claiming that the teacher doesn't actually deserve a job. But if God does it, it's infinitely perfect. So then emulating that should mean a teacher would be the perfect teacher, right? Guess not. We still expect teachers and parents to do the jobs of teachers and parents. What a shame we can't all be so perfect that just ignoring our children will lead them to knowing how much we love them. This guy did not need a church. He needed to be loved by people who care about his problems. He needed support and resources that won't just tell him to sweep things under the rug. He needed people who understand what he's been through and support from those who've already gotten through it. He needs evidence-based medicine and practice, not a negligent deity that ignores him until he wanders into the right building at the right time, and then still lets the people in that building do all the work. Even if they're wrong, at least they're doing something. It shouldn't be any surprise to you that my time at this church was mixed. I felt a lot of things that I haven't felt in years. I learned a lot about myself and about what going to church is like nowadays. I learned that the music doesn't get better. I learned that the problems that the laity go through are far too much for the level of education and training the staff have. And I learned that the toxic culture of codependence and ignoring real problems in the hopes that they go away with prayer is still in full force. I learned that no one really cares that much, so long as you say the right things and eat the brownies after church in the cafe. I learned that all of my pessimism about humanity, all the things I used to struggle with, all the hatred, all the self-loathing that went away once I became a philosophical optimist, they all came from the things that I accepted uncritically about being a Christian. We get to live the best life ever, and we also get to suffer for it. We get to enjoy living in constant fear of the persecution that we expect, but never really comes. We got all the benefits of neurosis, and few of the benefits of a healthy community. I want you to take a moment here at the end to breathe. Thank you so much for listening. No matter what the church may say, you're a beautiful, wonderful person who has value just because you exist. Whether you believe you are made in the image of God or not, you're valuable by default. Don't ever forget that. And if you need a reminder, feel free to drop a comment below. I'm happy to remind you that as long as you're here, you're a human. That being said, I'm Apollonius of Tired, and I want to leave you with one last note. You're deserving of love. You have inherent value. And remember to do whatever you need to in order to believe those things, because that is the truth.